Hail hail and welcome to part 5 of the Celtic History podcast series, which charts the history of Celtic Football Club from 1887 to the current day. In part 4 of the series, titled Still in the Hearts They Left Behind, Chris was joined by Tom Minogue from the Celtic Wiki, and they covered the period from 1930 to 1940. They talk about this challenging decade for the club, both on and off the field, as well as the struggles around that time for those who followed the club that they loved. There are more conspiracy theories, with talk of some questionable refereeing decisions throughout the decade, and how the biscuit tin approach by the Celtic board saw a number of our star players leave for the English League. The team head across the Atlantic for its first overseas tour, as they take part in a series of matches across the USA and Canada. We hear tales of legendary stars such as fans' favourite Bertie Thompson, Charlie Napier, Jimmy Delaney, Johnny Crumb and club captain Willie Lyon. There is, however, tragedy early in the 1930s with the shock death of young goalkeeper John Thompson. The club's fans and players face a difficult time as they are targeted due to their origins and religious beliefs. The boys detail a long-running world record set during the Scottish Cup final of 1937 and the clinching of the Empire Exhibition Cup the following year. There are details of a playing kit worn throughout the 1930s, as well as history of the stadium mixed with more fans' stories and confessions.
The refereeing was so bad that Celtic lodged a protest.
Celtic left Scotland in 1931 and crossed the Atlantic Ocean for the first time.
The one incident of the 30s that dwarfs everything else, of course, is the tragedy of John Thompson. This was a decade where there was a lot of crowd trouble and trouble with the fans going to and from the games.
They were ambushed by the Billy Boys, by Billy Fullerton's gang at Brickton Tube Station.
Celtic just wasn't the team that it was in the early part of the century.
Celtic were selling. The biscuit tin mentality was on the go at that time. But into the 30s, people like Charlie Napier, Willie Buchan, and of course Bertie, they were all sold to English clubs.
Only slight changes to the home kit were subtle differences added to the socks.
The term fan's favourite is always allocated to Bertie, Bertie Thompson. This is a red-headed, Irish, Celtic playing Catholic being assaulted at Tynecastle.
1937 and the Scottish Cup final where Celtic beat Aberdeen 2-1. Record crowd 147,365.
In season 1935-36, we experienced McGrory hit an incredible 50 goals, as Celtic romped to their first league title in a decade.
In 1938, we of course won the Exhibition Cup.
I was saying, oh, please score. If we score here, and I wasn't thinking about the game, I was just thinking, if we score, I'm going to get my leg over.
And for 2 hours during that month, I was in sheer ecstasy watching Celtic smash Rangers 6-2.
And in September 1939, the Scottish League and Cup would be suspended, as the world once more was plunged into war. It read simply, "They never die, who live in their hearts they leave behind."
Now we join Chris McGuigan for part 5 of a 10-part series, where he will cover the period from 1940 to 1950 with his guest from the Belfast Celtic Society, Mr. Marty Flynn.
Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic over all.
Chapter 5. Celtic Football Club, 1940 to 1950. Our 19th League Championship and victory in the Empire Exhibition Trophy meant that Celtic's Golden Jubilee year of 1938 had been celebrated in glorious style. These victories had been completed in an exhilarating fashion, and with talents such as Johnny Crumb, Jimmy Delaney and Malcolm MacDonald, fans of the Hoops could have been forgiven for dreaming of further success. But by 1940, war dominated the thoughts of all. Football was an irrelevance, or at least it should have been. The Scottish Football League had suspended competition in September 1939, and the Scottish Cup would be withdrawn for the duration of the war. The authorities recognised both the need to retain a certain sense of normality and the morale boost football could provide. With this in mind, unofficial regional leagues were formed. For fans of all clubs, whether they be in the trenches, on the farm, down the mine, or in the munitions factories. Football provided a distraction from the harsh reality of wartime. It was, perhaps more than ever, the most important of life's unimportant things. However, for Celtic fans, this distraction was increasingly an unwelcome one. The decade began in acrimonious fashion with the departure of iconic manager Willie Maley. With Celtic struggling at the bottom of the regional league, Maley's departure was announced in January 1940. It was a momentous, yet inevitable change. Willie Maley was part of the Celtic DNA. As secretary-manager at Parkhead, he had produced some of the greatest teams the game had ever seen. But now in his 70s, there was little doubt his powers had been on the wane for some time. Stubborn, cantankerous, and suffering increasingly from ill health, questions over his future had been asked for several years. Officially, the manager had retired, but this was far from the warm and gracious farewell deserving of a man who had dedicated more than 50 years to the Celtic cause. It was instead a departure soured by an ongoing financial dispute between Maley and the board. To mark the club's jubilee in 1938, the manager had been gifted by the club the sum of 2,500 guineas. It was meant as a golden handshake, but Maley refused to take the hint. There followed a bitter quarrel between Maley and the board as to who should pay the tax on this gift. The row would leave an unsightly stain on the relationship between Celtic and the man often regarded as the club's most famed figure. Maley would be replaced at Parkhead in February 1940 by Alloa manager and former Hoops centre-half Jimmy McStay. McStay was cut from a very different cloth to his predecessor. He was a quiet and thoughtful character, but one who lacked the presence or belligerent determination of Maley. He was a man who an increasingly interfering board believed would be influenced rather than influential. The war years were difficult for all. There were restrictions on crowds and wages, but many clubs demonstrated an admirable show must go on attitude in a bid to entertain and boost the morale of their support. It was not an approach shared at Parkhead. The Celtic board failed miserably in their task of maintaining standards at the club. The boys, like all teams, lost key players to the forces, but as others keenly recruited guest players from servicemen stationed in Scotland, the Parkhead board were indifferent to loan and fresh talent. While Morton fielded England greats like Stanley Matthews and Tommy Lawton, Celtic turned away Liverpool captain Matt Busby, a Lanarkshire-born lifelong Hoops fan. In stark contrast to their East End rivals, Rangers were fiercely proactive in holding on to and recruiting top players. Bill Striff worked tirelessly to ensure the Ibrox team strengthened their grip at the top of Scottish football. They maintained a keenly professional and disciplined regime, securing local employment for players and enticing top quality guests. Their domination of wartime football was emphatic. Celtic's bewildering lack of ambition ensured the club struggled throughout the war years. They were a club without momentum or direction. The Hoops' record in the West Regional and Southern Leagues was pitiful and included embarrassing 13th and 9th place finishes. Occasional victories in the Glasgow Cup, Charity Cup and Victory in Europe Cup were scant consolation for a support which remained faithful despite their frequently dire offerings on the pitch. Manager McStay was restricted by a recruitment policy which allowed him to sign only youngsters or players from the juniors. Any senior player could only be signed with the approval of the board. Needless to say, approval was seldom granted. This, added to the fact the board regularly interfered with team selection, and it's difficult to lay too much blame for Celtic's miserable malaise at the door of McStay. But perhaps unsurprisingly, that's exactly what the Parkhead board would do. Humiliatingly, McStay would discover the fact of his sacking, not from the board, but by reading about his dismissal in the press while on holiday. While it is doubtful McStay had the attributes to succeed as Celtic manager, his exit was unnecessarily cruel. Results and performances had been poor, but the roots of decline were planted firmly in the boardroom. Indeed, perhaps some credit should be given to a manager who, despite all the restrictions and interfering, would recruit 3 future Celtic greats in Willie Miller, John McPhail and Bobby Evans.
He said Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic over all.
Welcome to Chapter 5 of the Celtic History Podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to say I'm catching up with my old pal from Belfast, Marty Flynn from the Belfast Celtic Society, better known as Chuck from the Huddleport. How are you, Marty?
It's always a pleasure to speak to you, my friend.
At least the weather's a wee bit better from the last time we were having a wee chat.
If you remember starting in the city cemetery with me, and our feet were nearly blue a couple of months back doing the Belfast Celtic Trail, it's like chalk and cheese.
And that was actually the thing that prompted us to get involved and do the history of Glasgow Celtic, because I had so much fun doing the Belfast Celtic one.
And I can say it's worked so well so far. You know, everybody I've been speaking to who's listened to them has really, really enjoyed the podcast. And me and you have been chatting over the last couple of days, and you know how worried I am, because I have had the dubious honour of following Mr. Tom Minogue, who was fantastic, absolutely brilliant, head and shoulders, as far as I'm concerned, above anything I've listened to in the last couple of years, and the absolute epitome of an amateur researcher, an amateur historian. You know, what a fantastic yarn last week. It's an honour, it's a real honour to be asked, and it's been an honour to sort of dip my toe back into that era of the club, which I suppose for many people think is a write-off, but I think we know differently. There was so much happening over the course of that 10 years. Much of it had implications on the future of the club, you know, which we'll be digging out as we go on.
What's been funny about it so far is, you know, I give Paul Larkin the 20s, you know, and give you the 40s, and even next week I have Paul Brennan doing the 50s, and the three of you all came back to me and went, I got the short straw, I want to do the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. Then about, you know, a couple of days before we go to record, you get a wee text message. Never realised just so much happened in the 40s.
I know, and I mean, I suppose I'm lucky because, you know, I've been with my connections to the Belfast Celtic story. I have been dipping in into this for a couple of years, so I feel a wee bit more at ease in terms of going back and looking at the history, and you know, trying to, I suppose, trying to give players who and personalities involved their dues, you know, because a lot of them put their shoulders to the wheel in this decade for very, very little return, and I suppose the weight of the hand of history, to quote that Tony Blair, is on your shoulders, because you don't want to leave anybody out, and you know, you want to give them as fair a crack as you could, because they all played their part, you know.
Well, when you look at Celtic in this decade from 1940 and 1950, who better than somebody from the Belfast Celtic Society to talk about Charlie Tully and Bertie Peacock and the Irish influence at that stage as well? So, Marty, you're well suited, and no doubt you'll be absolutely fantastic.
We'll judge that when we finish, Christopher. We'll just see what happens at the end here.
So 1940 is a perfect place to start, Marty, because for the first time since the beginning of the club, we had a change of manager.
Indeed, and you know, I suppose the word pivotal in terms of the history of a football club, I suppose, can be overused, but in the history of Celtic Football Club, this was the pivotal moment. You had a man in Willie Maley who was the alpha and omega at the club. He had been there from day one, after he was sort of coaxed into playing by Walford and by John Glass and Taylor Welsh in 1887-88. So, you know, a 52-year career at the club. He was 71 years of age, and he was the man. You know, he was in control of matters abundant at the club, and his word was law. You know, he was a dictator. And you have to remember, when I was doing the reading to this, you were faced with people like Tom White and Robert Kelly and Desmond White and people like that who were emerging as board members. And you have to remember, Willie Maley run about with their dads, you know, and you know, their relatives, and so he was sort of looking down on them nearly as children. That's how I would have imagined the relationships were. So there was a frosty sort of an atmosphere at the club at the time, and I think they were looking for their opportunity to move Maley on, really. There had been lingering sort of a lingering annoyance over the 1931 tour of America. After Celtic won the Scottish Cup in the early 30s, they took the Scottish Cup to America, and Willie Maley had been insistent that his brother Tom Maley would have travelled with the Celtic party, and the Celtic party actually refused. The board at the time refused to allow this, and so Nearly took the huff. He took the huff and sort of pretended he was sick. And when he got to New York, he refused to leave his bed. He took to his hotel room and said, "I'm sick, and I want to go back to Glasgow, and I want Tom to be sent for to take me back." And lo and behold, when they got Tom over on the boat from Glasgow to New York, there was a very fit and fine Willie Maley at the dockside waiting to welcome him. So he was a wily character, and he didn't suffer fools gladly either, but very much a man of his own way and wanted to do his own thing, and less that was becoming acceptable. You had the great sort of Celtic squad captured the Empire Exhibition Trophy in the late 30s, and that really was a seriously good team led by Willie Lyon, who would go on to join the Royal Artillery in World War II and be decorated actually for his bravery in the war. You had that side there in the late 30s that had stars, stars aplenty of it. But after that sort of 37, 38, things began to go downhill pretty rapidly. And by 1940, halfway through the season, or even a third of the way through the season, Celtic were in major, major trouble. And the board at the time, led by Chairman Tom White, stepped in and used it as the opportunity that they wanted to get rid of this 71-year-old, really, who they felt had become too big for his boots. There was also an issue around a financial gift that was given to Maley in 1938 when the club celebrated its centenary. And basically he was given a big golden handshake and a thank you. And from the reading of the Celtic historians, they all seem to agree that it was a sort of a subtle hint to Maley, that now's the time you need to go. We've sorted you out here. I think the fee was 2,500 guineas at the time, which was a couple of bob, like. We were doing that in racehorse money in those days. You'd be flying, and he got into a powerful row with them because he didn't want to pay the tax, and he expected the club to pay the tax, and that really annoyed the directors because, as far as they were concerned, they were giving him a very generous gift, and he was. I suppose they felt he was throwing it back in their faces, So you had this festering relationship difficulty between the manager and the board. And remember, Willie Maley was still secretary of the club at the time too, so he had combined roles at the club and had probably had a finger in every pie. So you had the situation then where they moved him along, and at the time Jimmy McStay, who had played for the club as a defender in the early 30s with great distinction, and as did Willie McStay, another family member. McStay had been doing very well at Alloa at the time, and so they had brought him in. And I think the consensus really is that it wasn't a bad appointment. It was actually a pretty decent appointment. McStay was a good man and a good football man, knew his stuff, had captained the club, I think, at one stage, so he was a leader of men. But the problems that then beset Celtic from there on in were the problems really that would beset the club for the next 25 years until Jock kind of put the board in their place. McStay was, a gentleman, steeped in the Celtic traditions, different to his superiors, and that was his problem. He probably didn't stand up for himself enough, and the board then began to meddle in the areas that Willie Maley wouldn't have let them beforehand, and that would become a real noose around the neck of Celtic for the next almost 3 decades.
Back to the 1890s, to the time of the St Mary's Break clubs with their bugles and flags, their Irish immigrant background. They were singing, and they were singing Irish songs. It appears that their 2 big favourites then were A Nation Once Again and God Save Ireland. And then after the Easter Rising, they started singing Peter Kearney's Soldiers Song. And they also loved parodies, just as the supporters do today, about great victories and great players. And one of the funniest ones, actually, and it'll sound strange to modern Celtic supporters' ears, is a 1925 parody that had. They beat the Rangers 5-1 in the semi-final of the Cup that year, gave them a real walloping. And when they came back to the East End of Glasgow, they already had the song about the victory. And it might sound familiar to you. The beginning is, "Hello, hello, Gava Timaloys. Hello, hello, you'll know us by our noise. We beat the Rangers in the Cup. It was great to be alive by 1, 2, 3 or 4 or 5. So we've heard that familiarly elsewhere, haven't we, in the last 60 or 70 years. And just like ourselves, they praised the great players, Tommy McInally, Quinn Gallagher, McGrory. And what they did was they just took the tunes from the music hall hits of the day and from hymns and things like that. One of the big ones at that particular time, to the tune of John Brown's Body, was "We'll crown Patsy Gallagher King of Ireland and McGrory Prince of Wales." And they done a few really big ones, another very popular one. And the great thing about this next one was they kept changing it, because from generation to generation they could put different players' names in, and it was based on a song that had been big in the 1890s, would you believe, called "After the Ball." And the version I first remember hearing was "After the ball was centred, after the whistle blew, Patsy got up his temper and over the field he flew. They gave the ball to McGrory, Jimmy scored a goal. Now that was a goal for the Celtic, and the Rangers were up the pole, whatever the pole was, you know."
Oh, Ireland, land of song, your music lives forever, in its valleys and its mountains, in its hills and in its glens. Our music that survived through famine and oppression, to the generations gone, I'll sing to you the song.
And Jimmy McStay took over, obviously, during the wartime, and this is one period during Celtic history where things were just ambling along. There didn't seem to be very much ambition at the club. You know, the stars of yesteryear had, by and large, been replaced with a team that maybe, and we'll use a modern term now, maybe weren't Celtic class. And when you look at the positions that Celtic finished in during the war years, there just seemed to be no interest.
I would go further than that, actually, Chris. It was a disgusting period of Celtic's history, a really, really disgusting period. If you listen to the likes of Michael Kelly, you know, the ex-board member who was ousted in the early 90s, if you ever hear him talking today about you know, his relationship with Celtic and stuff, you'll hear him gurning about, you know, the old board were there to protect the Celtic traditions and the Celtic ethos and all that sort of thing. Well, you need to look no further than the 1940s to see how pathetic and tragic those his ilk and their approach was. I mean, to read out the league positions in 1939-40 in the Western Regional League, the year Willie Maley got the ball, they finished 13th. In 40-41 they finished 5th. In 41-42 they finished 3rd. In 42 and 43 they finished 9th. Then the next 2 years, 44 and 45, the 2 second place finishes, and finalised the 45-46 campaign in 4th. Who would ever look back on that as a defensible record? It's disgusting. And I suppose to put it into the context of the war, it was a much I mean, I listened to Harry Brady doing the war years a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, and I was struck actually by the amount of activity that happened, you know, in and around the time of the First World War, where they kept on, in general, you know, they kept the leagues on to help morale. That didn't happen in 1939 and 40, and it took a couple of months. You know, football was banned because they believed that, you know, the Germans would blitzkrieg the football matches. So when they allowed football back, stadiums were limited to 15,000, you know, within them. I mean, that's 15,000 paying customers, you know, and if you were getting 15,000 for every game, you know, that's going to help your club no matter what. You know, you're paying your players much less. We'll probably talk about this in a wee bit anyway, but the players' wages were capped. You know, in terms of football in the First World War, I mean, the strides that Maley took to keep the Celtic bandwagon rolling in the 14-18 war was unreal. You know, he ferreted out footballers from everywhere. We've just done the Mickey Hamill commemoration. Mickey Hamill was one of the reasons why they won the league in 1916. And we nearly kept sending for him because he couldn't find players. You know, the players were either called a player up one week and the next week the guy was away in the Royal Navy or somewhere. So he was sent to Belfast to get players over from Belfast Celtic to help the efforts at home in Glasgow. It really can't be understated, the activity that was going on, and you contrast that with the 40s, and it's crazy. I suppose the other thing that interested me generally was the attitude in terms of the war effort, for want of a better phrase. Again, Harry touched on the fact that many of the Celtic players did join up in the 1914-18 war. There were recruitment rallies at Celtic Park. There was a display of trench warfare as well. And
I suppose the perceived wisdom that's grown out of that was this club Celtic were I suppose trying to ingratiate themselves in Scottish society by showing that they could be, as British and as loyal as the other clubs. I actually completely disagree with that. I have a totally different view, and that the view is born out of nationalist politics in Ireland, and the fact that people like William McKillop and other MPs and political people who were involved with Celtic at the time in Glasgow. William McKillop had died a couple of years before, but they were so close to the Nationalist Party, and people like Joe Devlin in Belfast, the Redmondite people, and they were doing exactly the same thing in Ireland. They were encouraging recruitment to promote Irish Home Rule. That was the thing at the time. They were saying, if you go away and fight in the trenches for us, when you get back, we'll give you Home Rule. The Home Rule Bill's gone through in 1914. So the whole ethos of that approach was much more to do with what was happening in Ireland than what was happening, in France. And that's my view. A man sent us some information a few weeks ago to the Belfast Celtic Society about Celtic's visits to Belfast and to Cushendall in County Antrim in the late 20s. And Joe Devlin, the Nationalist MP, who was number 2 in the Nationalist Party behind John Redmond at the wartime, and was by that stage leader of the Nationalist Party in Belfast, he's thanking McKillop, and he's thanking at the dinners that they have. He's thanking his political friends in Glasgow at a Celtic function for all their support, during those years of the Home Rule crisis. So again, there's that attitude that Celtic is the Irish club in Scotland, and that bears it out. For me, it wasn't about this hurrah for the empire and that sort of thing. It wasn't about that. It was actually really wrapped up in home rule politics, in nationalism in Ireland. And there's where the contrast, I suppose, comes with World War II, because in World War II there was none of that. There was none of that fanfare about signing up for the troops. A lot of the players did go and fought in the war. I mentioned Willie Maley a minute ago, so there would have been still that sort of a process of watching who was out there fighting and trying to see who was coming home. But
which is a stark contrast to the First World War, as you say.
It's a total contrast. It really is a total contrast. The atmosphere is completely different, and they just more or less closed the park. Celtic Park by that stage, because they had the fan numbers were limited, so they more or less just gave up. That's my view of it. And into that maelstrom walked Jimmy McStay. And Jimmy McStay's there. Most of his first team players are either absolutely destroyed working down mines, or they've gone off to fight on the front somewhere, in some front, and he's left to pick up the pieces. And on top of that, the board are then interfering with his decisions as manager.
With the world at war for a second time, football was once again relegated to the sidelines as all efforts turned to the fighting. Though the national competitions were suspended, regional leagues organised by the clubs themselves were permitted to continue. But just as during the First World War, the majority of Celtic's squad either found itself away to war or working flat out in some other capacity. Jock Morrison retired from football in 1941 as working in the mines took its toll. Chick Keatons spent time out injured after a length of tubing was dropped on his foot while working in the cable works. Meanwhile, George Patterson and Frank Murphy joined the RAF, while Willie Lyon joined the Army. Despite this disruption, Patterson would later claim that joining the RAF had prolonged his playing career due to the nature of the work he did there, and even claimed that training day in, day out by playing matches and working with the ball throughout the week, rather than just making do with a couple of occasional laps around the park, was the way forward for football players. It would be some while before such radical thinking was to be brought in at Celtic, but it certainly did Patterson no harm when he scored the only goal of the New Year derby in 1945 in front of a massive crowd of 70,000. Despite the war, people still turned out in their droves for the big matches. The war did bring up some oddities, however. With no guarantee players would remain in one place in wartime, guest players were not unusual. Future Manchester United great Matt Busby spent some time playing for Hibernian, while the legendary Stanley Matthews featured for both Rangers and Morton. Celtic, however, never used guest players and preferred to stick to their own talent than rely on other inconsistent arrangements. With the River Clyde being a major aspect of Britain's war effort, Glasgow and the surrounding area were heavily targeted during the Blitz. While Clydebank suffered most with 2 nights of targeted bombing, few areas were left untouched as Glasgow itself was caught up in the bombings caused by aircraft releasing early to keep away from anti-aircraft fire. In all, 11 bombing raids were carried out by Nazi Germany on Scotland at the cost of 2,500 lives and another 8,000 more injured. Although the war itself ended in 1945, its effects would be felt for years to follow afterwards. Rationing continued in some aspect until 1954, while the New Towns Act of 1946 would see the populations of cities dispersed outside of the city limits. East Kilbride was designated a new town in 1947, while Cumbernauld followed in 1955 and Irvine in 1966. All three would pull away from the city of Glasgow. Despite these changes, when official football competitions returned for the 1946-47 season, 35,000 spectators turned out to watch Celtic lose 2-1 to Morton. It was a sign of things to come, as Celtic struggled badly on the park. The best performance from the team also saw one of the biggest attendances of the decade for Celtic, as 87,000 packed into Hampden Park to see Celtic beat third Lanark in the Glasgow Cup final of 1948. Just a few months earlier, 80,000 had seen Morton beat Celtic in the 1948 Scottish Cup semi-final at Capello. Although arguably the biggest game for Celtic that year came at Dens Park, when 31,000 watched Celtic beat Dundee 3-2 to stave off the threat of relegation from the Scottish Football League's top flight. Despite the Hoops finishing 12th out of 16 and ultimately 4 points clear of the relegation zone, the Celtic support never lost faith. When the first home match of the following season came around, 60,000 saw Celtic draw 0-0 with Morton.
Well, just to set the scene, though, Marty, what people may or may not know is that during the Second World War, a lot of teams signed guest players.
Indeed, and, because you could have been stationed, say Chris McGuigan played for, I don't know, Man United, and you go and join the Royal Navy, and you're sent to dry dock in Clyde until your boat's ready. So you had all these guys drifting about, with nothing to do until they were being dispatched off to far-flung corners of the world to take part in this slaughter. So people were looking for games, and when the regional leagues, for those who don't know, the Scottish league system, it wasn't like it is today with the SPL and all of that. There was chronic fuel shortages, and people had no money. So there was regional leagues established. The first one was in 1939 and 40, which was the Western Regional League that Celtic competed in. That was then disbanded, and a Southern League was formed. And, it was more or less, you played your neighbours, Clydes and Mortons and people who were sort of, I suppose, a Glasgow District League. And, you had all these guys, famous guys, Stanley Matthews, Matt Busby, they were all in and around Glasgow at the time. And for whatever mental, crazy reason, Celtic decided that they weren't prepared to bring these guys in. Now the theory is that while the money that was being paid to these players was kept at £2 a week, and then they got a bit of a bonus, there was inducements, under the table payments given to some of the bigger players, and that I suppose the theory is that Celtic didn't want to be involved in that. They didn't want to pay under the table for players who would maybe be only there a week or two. But they missed an awful lot of opportunities, they really did, and none more so than Matt Busby. Matt was a Lanarkshire man, and some say Celtic daft, and he actually wrote to Jimmy McStay and offered his services and said, Jimmy, look, I'm up here, so can I come and play? And Celtic board said no. And it's really hard to fathom. And as another way, I suppose, by comparison, this was a real purple patch in Belfast for Belfast Celtic, because they made full use of this. These guys who were at the Harlem docks and who were in dry dock and stationed here were welcomed them with open arms. At the time, Belfast Celtic had actually approached the first Irish black footballer, the first black footballer to play in the Irish leagues, Tommy Best. But they also managed to secure the services of Ron Greenwood, Chelsea defender, a young man at the time. But Ron Greenwood would go on to manage England. And those connections never ceased as long as those men were alive. They kept in contact with Celtic and with Belfast Celtic and their old playing colleagues. So it sort of beggars belief. You're going, my God. You had a player like Matt Busby who ended up playing for Hibs, and he's actually credited with the sort of purple patch that Hibs experienced in the early 50s. They say, well, that sort of stemmed from Busby because he brought good methods with him, and people watched him train and were impressed by him and took those on. And another, by way of a further contrast, Rangers made full use of these guys who were in town. Stanley Matthews, the absolute idol of his generation. Stanley Matthews played for Rangers, and I think he also played for Greenock Morton. And back in Belfast, Jackie Milburn, who's Jack Charlton's uncle, the great towering football figure from Newcastle, was turning out for Linfield. So it beggars belief. Why wouldn't you have these guys if they were on your doorstep? Why wouldn't you use them?
Well, the proof was in the pudding, because Rangers won the league every year.
Well, the old saying was Rangers lifted everything but a rifle, in that era. But I mean, Celtic fans aren't slow of digging Rangers fans up on that. The fact that their manager Bill Struth went to great lengths, to make sure that his players got reserve jobs in Govan, basically, so that they were all on his doorstep, whereas Celtic didn't really do that. A lot of their players were in the mines, and you have stories of people turning up, John Divers turning up in his whip gear, absolutely exhausted, after doing a 12-hour shift. And people working in various factories and in reserved occupations, and also to the fact that they weren't around Celtic Park, many of them, so they all had to travel in, and because of the rationing of fuel shortages and transport problems, a lot of them couldn't make the games. As crazy as it sounds, they might not have been that far away, but there was just no method of getting them there, and if they had got them there, they'd have had to have walked, which is crazy. Could you imagine walking 50 miles from somewhere in South Lanarkshire or somewhere like that to then play football? It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible.
When you look at the way Jimmy McStay is remembered in Celtic history, when you put all those facts into place, he was really trying to manage a team not with one hand tied behind his back, but with two hands tied behind his back.
With two hands tied behind his back and 2 feet, because the board made his job impossible. It wasn't just his methods or the type of players that he scouted. If you look at some of the players, we'll probably talk about this later on, but there was some damn good talent emerging at that time, and McStay had no problems going and fighting it. And when he was replaced at Celtic by Jimmy McGrory kept him on as a scout. So a lot of the really good players that emerged in the early 50s and stuff were all unearthed by Jimmy McStay. So this guy was no mug. He really wasn't. He was no mug. And as I said earlier on, what you're going to see emerge in the 40s are the problems that beset this club for the next 25 years. Very bad leadership, or very indifferent leadership. In some ways, wildly exciting in its thinking, and in other ways, absolutely hamstrung in its approach. And I mean, in 1940, Celtic took the decision to employ Alec Dowdles as the trainer. Alec Dowdles was there for 10 years, a decade, ensuring that the players were fit. Good thinking, get this guy in and we'll keep our players fit and blah, blah, blah. But then, totally, with their other crazy decisions that they were making around and making it a useless decision, making it detrimental then to the club. So it's very, very hard to square that circle. Why? These guys, a lot of them had been around the club for years. And Robert Kelly was very fondly remembered by the Celtic support when he died. There wasn't too many raised their voices against him. Despite the fact that he had sort of hamstrung the club for much of his tenure involved in it, but he also made good decisions too, and people would have remembered him very much. I know this will probably come up in the 50s, but the flag protest as well, where he stood up to the SFA, and threatened to pull Celtic out of the league. A lot of his sins were covered up by those sorts of actions, where he really did step up to the plate and defend the club. So it's a crazy time. It's a completely crazy time, and into the middle of this, you're throwing all the other stuff that goes on with the war. It's mental.
And when you look at the trophy haul that we had during the 40s, well, let's talk about wartime first of all. We won one Glasgow Cup in 1941, Won Charity Cup in 1943, and then we'll get on to the Victory in Europe Cup in 1945 in a minute. So at that stage, the Celtic team, while Rangers were sweeping everything in front of them, just had no interest. And I think that came through a little bit when you read about the attitude of the players at the time. And eventually this ground down Jimmy McStay to the point where in 1945 I think he just walked away, couldn't be bothered anymore.
Yeah, well, and it's amazing he didn't do it before. When you look at that, he won the Glasgow Cup. The Glasgow Cup was won in 1940 and the Charity Cup in 42, but both of them were against very depleted opposition. So we're lucky to win those. It's lucky we won anything. And it's I think we played Rangers 25 times over the course of the war, and I think we won 4. So that says it all.
You thought the 90s were bad?
And imagine you're turned up, and they just, you're in that sort of a wartime environment where morale is everything. People are waking up in the morning, they knock on the door, to say, look, your son's dead. Mm-hmm. There was no thought given to our fans during the war at all. They didn't care. Tom Waite died just after the war, so he was elderly. He was getting on a bit, and he probably just, he was probably, I suppose the next way I've said, he was a bit too conservative for the times. It should have been, Celtic Park should have been an absolute mecca for people to come and enjoy themselves while the war was on, because it was a phenomenally bad time. There wouldn't have been one pit village or one district of Glasgow that families weren't touched. Celtic families weren't touched by this war, and they should have been putting their necks on the block to say, well, look, we're going to do our best for you here. We know the situation's bad, we know about the transport problems, we know about the food rationing. It's hard to feed our players. It sounds crazy.
Yeah.
We talked about it when we were doing the Belfast Celtic story, the fact that Elisha Scott, Belfast Celtic's manager, went out into the country himself and sourced food, ham, eggs, bread, and gave it to the players on a Thursday night.
Incredible.
To feed them on a Friday.
Incredible when you think back to that, isn't it?
Yeah, and that was happening in Glasgow, there's no doubt. But it just goes to show you that with a bit of effort and a bit of thought, things could have been done differently, and Celtic, this disgrace to our club over this period really shouldn't have been.
We seek him here, we seek him there, never to find is very rare. You can go to any single country in the world and you'll find dedicated followers of Celtic.
Right, I'm here with Eamon today. I'm going to talk about his favourite away game.
Barcelona away in 2004 at Nou Camp. Game David Marshall played his first actual start for Celtic. Drew 0-0 and just played a blinder. Must have maybe 8 or 10 shots for Ronaldinho, just teared them apart the whole game. Don't know how they managed to not get beat. Just amazing. Still never ever get back to Barcelona after going. Only been once.
From County Clare to Singapore or China, America or Canada, you'll find him. You never hide his colours, cause these colours they don't run, cause he's a dedicated follower of Celtic.
Probably say my favourite player was Peter Grant, for everything that he did to the team. Maybe not the best quality player, but hunters of heart. And my favourite game would probably be when we beat Real Madrid in 1982 in the European Cup. Always remember it and look at that ticket stub quite fondly and look at the price of it, £2.50. Belton.
He's a dedicated follower of Celtic. Throughout the years, we've had our times, 9 in a row, with Buckfast wine.
Right here today, the Green Brigade anti-discrimination thing, and we've got a fella here who wants to talk about Celtic.
My favourite Celtic player was, it has to be by a mile, probably not the best player ever played for Celtic, but it's definitely Henrik Larsson. Just for the way, the sheer fact that he was just such a determined player who was just had such a complete utter class about him, who probably knew that he could go to so many great clubs, yet he still stayed with Celtic to make sure he could do everything he could for the club. Obviously I'm quite young, so I don't remember much other Celtic players beyond his time, but in my opinion he's one of the greatest players that to play for Celtic, whoever will play for Celtic.
Clare to Singapore or China, America or Canada, you'll find him.
Hey, I'm here with Johnny at the anti-discrimination tournament, so on you go.
Favourite player? Lubo. Favourite game? 5-1. Monkeys, Parkhead.
Right, I'm here with Paul at the anti-discrimination brief. Paul, your favourite Celtic player and why?
Oh, well, my favourite Celtic player is definitely Charlie Nicholas. I grew up when I was a wee boy, grew up with Charlie Nicholas. He was the best young player in Europe at the time. I think it's been well mentioned that all the clubs, all the big clubs in Europe was after him. He ended up going to Arsenal. But I remember crying as a 6-year-old when he left for Arsenal, and he came back and he was still class.
Good morning, London. This is the 7 o'clock news, and I'm William Westmacott. Today's top headline: Phil Montgomery commands invasion breakthrough. The combined effort of the Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy yesterday morning. The Royal Air Force now press on to extend air supremacy over occupied France.
Alright, so I want to bring you back to 1942, and there was a significant development, and we all love the old crowd trouble stories. 1942, there was trouble at Ibrox, and that meant trouble for Celtic.
There was, and this again, there's this whole attitude that's grown up about Celtic's paranoia and all of that. If you have people like Tom Waite and Robert Kelly really raising their voices in complaint against the SFA, you've got a problem, because these guys tended to defer to their betters, their social betters and that sort of thing, and not rock the boat too much. And there was disgraceful refereeing decisions taking place against Celtic, and in one case where 2 players were sent off against Rangers, and then the next one that we'll probably come back to, in one case where a referee was drunk, and Celtic had complained. But this myth has grown up among our cousins from across the Clyde that Celtic Park was closed due to pro-German singing and anti-British activities in Celtic Park, which is a lie, basically. The trouble was actually at Ibrox, and Celtic were punished by having their ground closed for a month, and the trouble erupted in the stands again as a result of a refereeing decision. It was nothing to do with singing or sing-songs or pro-German nonsense. It was Celtic were in the eyes of the fans being kept down, and our fans aren't stupid. Our fans aren't daft. They might react emotionally, but they can see what's in front of them. And we've seen it even ourselves over the last couple of years when Tony Mowbray was here, and they were trying to keep, clearly some decision was being taken to keep Rangers afloat and to keep them in Europe. So we're not stupid. And this reaction to the fans then has gone into folklore as some sort of, anti-British protest, but it was nothing of the sort. Nothing at all of the sort. And the fact that the Celtic board at that time came out so strongly, and really did protest and asked for appeals, and their appeals were refused, it shows you that there had to have been something to it, because again, Robert Kelly and Tom Waite got the bit between their teeth, and by that time too, Desmond Waite had joined the board as well as a director, as secretary to replace Willie Maley, and they went for it. They went for the SFA at the time, and were very, very public about their annoyance of what was going on. So, funny haha, but it was actually hairy. It was hairy at the time, and it did do a lot of damage again to the club.
So in 1944 saw a strange development as well with Celtic, because the Supporters Association actually founded then.
That's right, and this was seen at the time as, I suppose, a glorious return of the tradition of the break clubs. But I suppose it belies the problem. It lets you know that there was an issue, that the fans actually felt as if they needed to, I suppose, band together to make their voices heard, because they weren't happy with what was going on. And this would culminate in a couple of years' time when there were actually protests outside Celtic Park. But what I found really funny was, when I was reading back over this period of the history, some of the Celtic authors, some of these books were written in the 80s. And what I found really funny was that...
I know what you're going to say here.
Yeah, some of the authors were writing, it was great that initially when they started up, they said that they wouldn't protest and they wouldn't organise boycotts and this sort of stuff. And I'm reading this thinking, Jesus Christ, You know, as if this was some wonderful development that the Celtic fans were staunch and didn't boycott their club and all this crack. And like 6-7 years later, the exact opposite was happening at Celtic Park. That the Celts for Change had started up, and the remnants over the old board was being swept away. You know, so it was a very interesting development. You know, and the Celtic supporters rallies then started not long after that, and we still have the association today.
And that actually is a good point, and maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. But in 1946, it was actually a protest outside Celtic Park.
You know, so that's within 2 years. You know, within 2 years, they were actually making their voices heard. And you know, that the strange thing about it, we haven't spoken about him yet. And again, we probably are jumping ahead of ourselves, but Kelly was making these decisions, and Tom White were making these decisions, and some of them were really popular. You know, so some of them were placating the fans. For example, the appointment of Jimmy McGrory, you know, and the letting go of Jimmy McStay was a popular thing. You know, the Celtic fans were right behind it. But there we are, a year into McGrory's reign, and people are realising there's a problem here. The board are still interfering in team selection, and they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, basically. And you have the tramp of feet down Janefield Street, you know, that they raise their hackles against the old board. So some would say, you know, what's new? Some would say that's the Celtic all over, you know, and we still have an interesting relationship, I suppose, as fans with the board today, you know, and have done over the last decade, even though it has been broadly successful. You know, so it probably says more about the Celtic fans than anything else. You know, the fact that they're not afraid to stand up for their club, and other clubs not too far away could maybe take a leaf out of our book.
So I caught up with Derek Taylor, who's one of the main Celtic collectors out there in Celtic fandom, and how do we chat about this phenomena that Celtic fans enjoy so much? Why do Celtic fans collect all this stuff?
Probably just, you know, the Celtic fans are just kind of unique in ways. You know, it's a massive family club and just very passionate about everything Celtic, you know, as well as everybody wanting to go to the games. They like the souvenirs and collectible items that go with it, and you know, they get quite heavy into it sometimes.
And you would probably describe yourself as one of these fanatics. What got you into it?
Like all the fans, you know, I was a big Celtic collector as well. I've collected, you know, other things, but Celtic obviously now is my main passion and my main thing for collecting. And is it programmes? Is it medals? Is it scarves? What kind of things do you collect? Well, myself personally, I like mainly like things that are paperwork, you know, from tickets, postcards, brochures, photographs, just old paper artefacts to do with the club. You know, that's my sort of favourite items myself. But collectors, yeah, there's different collectors for programmes, strips, badges is a big thing, just a wide range of things in Celtic.
How and where did you start collecting things like old photographs and old newspapers and the written word about Celtic?
My problem is I'm getting that old, I can't remember when I started. Big time Celtic I've been collecting probably 20, 30 years, you know, but I've also been collecting, you know, a lot longer than that, because before I became a proper Celtic collector, I was always buying things and putting it aside, and probably for the first 5-10 years I didn't really consider myself a serious collector. And it's just this last 20 years or so that I've really got into it and chased things up quite heavily.
Do you find that with the phenomena of memorabilia that there's a lot of opposition out there to you? Is there a lot of people out there collecting it? And do you find yourself, you know, maybe searching for the same thing that other fans are looking for and maybe bidding against each other?
Yes, a lot of that. There's a lot of collectors, and yes, you often, you know, come across, you know, people who become your friends, and you know, you go to auctions and you end up in slight bidding wars with them. Times are a wee bit tougher now, so if you do see a friend there, you know, and there's two items, you could always say, you know, like, well, there's two items, what about you going for one, me going for the other, and so on, you know, so I've done that often as well.
So give us a few little examples of some of the rare stuff that you found, or some are even of the more interesting parts within your collection.
Well, one of my favourite items is something that I picked up just recently. When I say recent, in about the last year or so, it was a a fan in the 1930 period, obviously, wrote to John Thompson, who was his hero, and he asked him if he could get an autograph. And John Thompson kindly wrote back to the chap, not only just with his autograph, but he went round the rest of the team and the manager at the time and sent this with a lovely 10, 12-line letter back to the fan, saying he was delighted to do it and delighted to help him, and, you know, if he needed anything again, just get in touch. And, you know, I picked that up, and it's just, you know, obviously he signed his letter as well, so not only have I got one autograph, but I got two of John Thompson, so that's one of my favourite items. I'm a great fan of Jock, who I think just changed the club dramatically. So I've got, you know, original Jock contracts, Jock playing a game for Linlethely in a programme, Jock playing a trialist game before he even went to Linlethely, different things to do, and, you know, lots of different photographs of him. So those are some of my favourite items.
What do you do with them, Terry?
Yeah,
do you keep them in a drawer?
I trip over them often enough. But yeah, they're just. I've just got so much stuff. It's fast. You know, some of my stuff is up in my brother's house, some in my sister's house. You know, some in my own house. You know, but it's just. I could say that I don't display anything in my house. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's madness. You collect all this and then you stick it in boxes and drawers and cupboards. You know. But a bit crazy.
Have you ever been invited by Celtic to display any of the stuff at the club, or was there any talk about, you know, lending them some artefacts so that they can sort of put them on display at the football club or any official event?
Yes, I've a great relationship with Celtic ever since the 90s when Mr. McCann came in. He changed the whole concept of the club, and the museum became a bigger thing, and the museum curator at the time was a young girl called Margot McQuaig, and she was fantastic, and I loaned stuff to the club then, and I continue to do today with Maura and Chris at the club, who are just absolutely superb as well today, and I've often got a good relation with Celtic, yes, and quite a few things go on display at the club, yes, that's for sure.
What, like?
The jersey next to the European Cup, the Chalmers jersey, that's mine.
Ah, very good. In the display cabinet?
That's correct, yes.
It's funny now when you look back in these little drawers that we all have hidden away and stuff put up in the loft. You know, we all know about the medals and the shirts and pennants and scarves and all this. But, you know, remember the old Action Man and the Subudio teams, and, you know, even there was a blow-up Jinky at one stage. What sort of unique collectibles have you got that's not just your usual bog standard scarves, hats and T-shirt stuff?
Unique or crazy might be the better idea for words about when it comes to me. I must be a right sad git. I've still got the centenary pie cover from 1988.
That's exactly what I was looking for.
I've also still got a fully wrapped with a Celtic crest and all the details about it from the temporary stand, you know, the poncho that they gave out.
Yes.
You know, in 19, God, I think obviously that would be 95.
94, 95, well, yeah.
So, you know, I've got some, but the items you mentioned, the Action Man, I've got the original Action Man as well, so, yeah. Sad might be sad. It just does sound a wee bit sad, but really, really good to have in the collection.
And when nobody's watching, do you still take it out of the box and have a wee play with it?
No, the Action Man is actually on display at the Celtic Park. It was one of the things I gave away back in the 90s.
There you go.
There you go. So, but it's quite crazy. I believe that the Celtic Action Man, the original, is worth probably £100 to £200. So it's quite a wee collectible item.
So we spoke earlier on, Marty, about the signing policy during this period, and we touched on the fact that Jimmy McStay was only allowed to sign, you know, certain younger players and junior players, but he still managed to dig up some nuggets at the time too.
He did, and you know, I suppose Willie Maley was so famous for that, you know. bringing these young players through, you know, over the course of the 50 years, finding these young nuggets, you know, looking at boys' gills and things like that. You sort of have to place this into the context of Maley leaving too. I can't really think of anybody of any club who would have had a figure like him for so long. You know, 52 years in a club, in so many roles. You know, chief scout, secretary, manager, you know, board member. He was integral to the club. You know, even people like Bobby Charlton, you know, who have been associated with clubs like Man United, for example, over the last 50 years or so. Maley was in control. You know, Maley had his hands on the wheels of the Celtic bus, and then you're coming into this situation where, you know, the only players that you're going to be able to use are kids. You know, Celtic did retain some pretty damn decent players, you know, from the late 30s. People like Bobby Hogg, for a time anyway. People like Crum and Divers, and, you know, Malcolm MacDonald was there for years and years and was a real Celtic man. And then a lot of them were let go. You know, a lot of them were got rid of pretty quickly, and then they went on to other clubs and bloody haunted Celtic. You know, they took their skills to places like Falkirk and Morton and came back to haunt the club, who at that time were blooding loads of young kids. And what they were saying was, so somebody had said it was like booking the Philharmonic Orchestra and then cutting the strings of the stringed instruments. You know, it was like you had all these young colts, young players, some of whom were damn talented, but you had nobody there to help them along, and, you know, that wee bit of experience. The one player that they did have was Jimmy Delaney, you know, that huge big star of the 30s. But Jimmy Delaney broke his arm in 1940 and actually missed 2 full years of football. And it wasn't really until Jimmy Delaney came back into the side then in the mid 40s that Celtic began to produce sort of respectable performances, because he was the string puller, he was the orchestrator, he was, you know, bringing these young men into the game and you know, showing them how to play football. But I mean, if you look again, it's nearly a schizophrenic time. There was so much bad things happening, but there was also, you know, real nuggets happening in there, and things that would sort of emerge to help Celtic in years to come. I suppose the most obvious example of that would be 2 young players who were both 17 in the same, one in 1942 and one in 1944. The first was John McPhail, Hookie, you know, and initially they didn't know what to do with him. He was a big lump of a boy, and they thought, you know, stick him in the defence. But he didn't become a Celtic star really until they used him as a utility forward, and found out he was damn good at racking the ball into the net, and he was powerful with a shot, and, you know, good with tall guys, so good with the head. And, you know, there's John McPhail still playing in 1957 when we're humping Rangers 7-1. You know, in 1944 then you had young Bobby Evans who came through, you know, and again didn't know what to do with him, and until he settled down into a position at sort of right half, and he found his place, and he was there for years. You know, he was there for 15, 16, 17 years. After that, went on to, you know, play for Scotland within a couple of years. You know, so there was definitely talent emerging, and it was just so schizophrenic. The real hero of the piece for Celtic, I've mentioned Delaney, but the other real hero was Willie Miller, the great goalkeeper of the time, and everyone seems to agree. You know, the broad consensus is that if it hadn't been for Willie Miller, those years would have been even worse. Mm-hmm. You know, a very, very brave guy, and damn good between the sticks. You know, not afraid to put himself about, that sort of thing. And another reflection of it too would have been, at that time, in contrast to Belfast Celtic had a bloody embarrassment of riches. You know, they had, at that time, Belfast Celtic's reserves were meeting their senior teams in cup finals. Why weren't they going to Belfast and saying, look, can you lend us a couple of players here to keep us going, like Maley had done in the teens? You know, and it's very, very hard to grapple with. You know, the wage demands of the players were nil. You know, they were all reserved occupations, and then they were getting their £2 a week from the club. You know, so the Celtic could have done much, much more to solidify those teams. And the lethargy of that time carried on. You know, it didn't just stop when the war stopped. You know, we'll talk later on about the late 40s, but there was an awful, awful atmosphere over the club. They had let things go. And Alec Dowdall's the trainer, said it himself, and he says, look, we were a mess. And he says even the stands of the park, you know, were filthy. There were weeds growing up through Celtic Park. The roof of the jungle was leaking. You know, there was massive, massive works needed done. And those works should have been done promptly, you know. But they were sitting at the end of the war going, oh my God, what are we going to do now? You know, we had all these young boys in, you know, who really were doing their best. You can't deny it. You know, the fourth, you know, as I said, the last 2 years of the war, Celtic finished in second place. So something was happening. You know, Jimmy McStay was clearly doing something right. You know, but as I say, hands and feet both tied.
Celtic first and Celtic last and Celtic over all.
When the war ended in 1945, the whole of Europe was faced with a daunting rebuilding task. In footballing terms, there was a similar challenge awaiting at Celtic Park. The legendary Jimmy McGrory had been recruited as manager from Kilmarnock. The appointment of an acclaimed Hoops hero was warmly welcomed, but any hope of a change in fortune would fade fast. Like McStay, McGrory was simply too much of a gentleman to challenge the entitlement, arrogance and meddling of a complacent board. It would be tempting to describe Celtic as their own worst enemy during this period. However, that would be to ignore the actions and attitude of an increasingly hostile SFA. Throughout the 1940s, Celtic and its players would find themselves at the receiving end of some astonishing rulings made by the Scottish Games governing body. Under the leadership of Secretary George Graham, the SFA appeared to embark on a campaign of inexplicable hostility towards the Parkhead club. If there was any doubt Scotland's football establishment was riddled with prejudice, then the SFA seemed determined to remove it, with a series of draconian punishments, the harshness of which seemed exclusively reserved for Celtic and their players. In 1941, a derby game at Ibrox was marred by crowd trouble after Rangers players aggressively hounded the referee following a disputed penalty decision. While Rangers escaped with a mild censure, the SFA astonishingly ordered the closure of Celtic Park for an entire month. In 1946, the semi-final replay of the Victory Cup between the Glasgow rivals would add to Celtic's feelings of victimisation and injustice. The replay would be officiated by referee Matthew Dale. An unpopular figure amongst the Celtic support, Dale was a pompous official, well known for his strong affinity to Rangers. From his first whistle, Dale caused concern amongst the Celtic ranks with a string of dubious decisions, and it became evident it was not just a blatant bias affecting the referee's calls. When placing the ball for a free kick, Dale lost his balance and fell to the floor. The respected Celtic skipper George Patterson leaned down and helped the referee to his feet. As he pulled the official up from the turf, the Hoops defender caught the smell of alcohol from Dale's breath. George immediately inquired of the ref if he was feeling alright. Dale responded to this request by issuing an incredulous Patterson with a caution. At half-time, Celtic informed SFA Secretary Graham of their suspicions and requested urgent action be taken. Graham assured the club the matter would be dealt with promptly, but as the teams took to the field for the second half, they were joined once again by Mr. Dale. The match would descend into chaos, with both Patterson and Hoops fullback Jimmy Mallon being sent off for dissent after Dale awarded Rangers the softest of penalties. What should have been an enthralling cup tie had become a farce. Celtic were furious at the actions of Dale and at the fact the SFA had allowed him to take charge of a game when he was clearly in no fit state to do so. However, any hope that the SFA would belatedly put right this wrong was soon dashed. Dale would go unpunished, but at the next meeting of the SFA's referee committee, Patterson and Mallon would receive a staggering 3-month ban. The suspension of Patterson devastated a man who had played for 11 seasons without picking up a single caution. Despite the outroar, little would change, and in 1949, Celtic's new hero, Charlie Tully, would receive a 1-month ban following further crowd trouble, despite his primary role in the matter being one of a victim, having been assaulted by the boot of Rangers defender Sammy Cox. Despite all of this, there could be no denying most of the damage caused to Celtic in the 1940s was self-inflicted. The short-sighted mismanagement of the war years would leave the club hopeless and rudderless, for the remainder of a decade. By the time fully fledged competitive football returned in season 46-47, mediocrity had become the norm, a Parkhead in short supply of skill and desire. The talents of Jimmy Delaney had provided rare moments of entertainment and hope during the dark days of the war. But when the club refused to meet his modest financial request, he was moved on to Manchester United in 1946. In season 47-48, Delaney was assisting United lift the FA Cup. But back in Scotland, Celtic were embarking on a battle against relegation. The club would go into the last match of the season at Dundee, knowing only a win would guarantee top-flight survival. Despite a goal from Jock Weir, Celtic trailed with the home side 2-1, with just half an hour remaining. Weir had been bought a few months previously from Blackburn for the then considerable sum of £7,000. The size of the fee reflective of the panic which had gripped Parkhead as the club struggled for survival. A fast and strong forward, it had been hoped Weir's presence up front would inspire Celtic to safety. With just minutes to go at Dens, Weir popped up with an equaliser. Then, as the game entered its final stages, the forward completed a hat-trick as he grabbed a winner and wrote his name into Celtic history. Even if Jock Weir never kicked another ball for Celtic, he'd repaid every penny of his fee. After such a dangerous flirtation with relegation, Celtic would show steady but unspectacular improvement. There would remain little to cheer though. In a decade, Celtic fans were desperate to bid good riddance. Men like Delaney, and the brave and brilliant goalkeeper Willie Maley, are rightly regarded as all-time Celtic greats. But in the 1940s, such talents were exceptions to the Parkhead rule. For decades, Scottish football had revolved around the fierce rivalry between Celtic and Rangers. New talent was emerging in the East End in the form of McPhail, Evans and the exciting Irishman Tully. But as 1950 appeared on the horizon, the once frequently visited pinnacle of Scottish football must have never seemed more distant.
But 1945 as well was a new dawn. When you look at, again, the club changes their manager, the stadium starts to get tidied up a little bit, the Players Association formed in 1945, there was new wage proposals and things like that. So right after the war was over, there seemed to be a sense of optimism all around.
It was very short-lived, Chris, and that's borne out by your reminding that people were protesting. Within a year, there was protests outside the park.
Sure.
So there was problems. There was major diffs with Celtic at that time, and the players were coming and going. And they had tried to attract some of the older players back and asked them to come and play. But you had the likes of Jimmy Delaney, who had really done his best for the club in the 40s, and was then told, your wages aren't being raised, and who left for Man United. Jimmy Delaney played up until he was 41. You know what I mean? He was in Ireland in 1954, winning the Irish Cup with Derry. And this is only 1945.
Yeah.
Every effort should have been made to keep Jimmy Delaney at the club, and have an experienced old head in there to help the young players coming through, because there was definitely talent at the club, but it was just, and the whole way that Jimmy McStay was treated. Jimmy McStay was on his holidays, in Ayrshire, and was coming back to Glasgow on a train, and saw on a newspaper billboard that Jimmy McGrory was going to be appointed as Celtic manager. That was the first he'd heard of it. It was a disgusting way to behave, and we all know from the history of Celtic, this will come up again in the 80s, the way people were treated, by the board, and it was, it's not conducive to the atmosphere of a club that's going to work. You have these madcap decisions being made, and Robert Kelly then reflected. I've read Kelly's Celtic, his autobiography, and he said in his memoir that this was Jimmy McStay was a part-time manager, but nobody told Jimmy McStay.
That's right.
Nobody told him. If he was a part-time manager, then his remit should have been set out as a part-time manager. You know, and as I say, his devotion to the club was such that he came back and helped Jimmy McGrory. There's no doubt about it. You know, he went out and found players for him and sent them up to the park and all of that. You know, so God bless him. He was a good Celtic man, and I think he was disgracefully treated. I really do.
Mm-hmm. And in 1947, again, there was strange goings on as well. Because Tom White, as you said earlier, dies, and that's where Robert Kelly really moves in to take control of the club when he became chairman.
And again, this was another changing of the guard moment. You know, this is another pivotal point in history. And really, the roots of the problems that we suffered in the late 80s and early 90s are found here. And that's why it makes the 40s such a damn interesting time. So you had Tom White dying, and Desmond White then taking the full place on the board. And what you saw then was too, that's often forgot about, is that Tom Colgan, who was a Celtic director from 1906 up until 1939, also died as well. But it's the most crucial aspect of the club. It really is, because Robert Kelly, the Kelly family's holding in Celtic was actually quite small. You know, in comparison to Colgan's shares. Colgan owned the old O'Hara share, which had an amalgamated sort of from the early 1900s. A lot of people had died, and those shares had coalesced around the O'Hara family. Then O'Hara died as well, and when he died, Tom Colgan, who was his son-in-law, took his place on the board, and he was there until 1939. He was there through that whole period of history with Maley, and had a very, very unsettled relationship with Maley. I don't think they liked each other. And Colgan then came back Colgan was unwell, and when the war broke out in 1939, he felt that he would be better coming home to Ireland instead of staying in the city. So he came back to Toonbridge here in County Antrim to live with his family, and immediately Belfast Celtic knew he was coming. They all knew each other, and went straight to Colgan and says, "Look, we want you to come onto our board." So Colgan actually sat on the Belfast Celtic board then from 1939 to 1947 when he died. So when Colgan dies, his shares are then passed on through his family, and they end up in the hands of a lady called Felicia Grant, who was his niece. And Robert Kelly used Felicia Grant, and used that Grant and Colgan and O'Hara family holding to cement his power at the club. And there was this myth that grew up around Celtic, and older supporters will tell you, supporters from the 50s and 60s, there was this myth that this wee old woman in Ireland owned Celtic. That myth was absolutely true. It was spot on. Felicia Grant had the majority or the major shareholding in Celtic, and Kelly kept her sweet. Robert Kelly used to holiday every year in Cushendall, and he would have headed up from the Glens of Antrim up into Toonbridge, had his tea and stayed overnight with the Grant family, and kept Felicia sweet. This is what's happening at the club at the minute. We've found this young guy. He's going to be the man for us. You know, the crowds are coming back. We've won this, we've won that. You know, here's our plans. We're going to America. We're doing all these different things. Felicia Grant didn't care. She had no interest in football at all. She didn't give a damn. But he used her shares as the weight of voting in the board. And
so you hear about all these discussions in graveyards when the Fergus McCann takeover happened. This all happened in the 40s too. These things were true. The Grant and Colgan holding in the club was the key for Fergus McCann to get Celtic. If Fergus McCann hadn't have got those shares, he'd have been beaten by the old board, because they had enough to keep him out. So there was all these representations made at home here in Ireland to say, look, listen, we know you love Robert Kelly, but his son's wrecking the club. Here's what's going on. You know, they were trying to say, look, we know that you have been connected with these guys for years, but if you don't give us your shares, you won't have a club. And the roots of that whole row, that whole, you know, schism in the club in the early 90s, where, you know, with the 60,000 seater stadium emerged, this is all relating back to the 40s. You know, people brushed the 40s off. It was a terrible time, there was a war on. There was a war on for Celtic. I mean, this was where the decisions were being made that would absolutely, you know, flummox people for years to come, and would cause so much upset and eventually bring so much joy. You know, so that
kind of story, I think, remains very much untold, and I think it needs to be revisited in some way, in a serious way, by the historians connected to the club, and maybe somebody, listening to this podcast will sort of do the spade work and roll up the sleeves, to get in about it,
Through 1940 to 1950, the Celtic home kit wouldn't change. Our green and white hoops were worn throughout this decade, along with the ever-present white shorts. The shirt was completed with a white collar and white cuffs, and the socks were mainly green apart from two thick white hoops, one around the ankle and the other just below the knee. The only evidence I can find of an away kit through this decade was from 1948 to 1949, where the Celtic away kit was an all-white shirt with a green shamrock adoring the left breast. Although we wore this style of away shirt in the 1920 to 1930 season, the main difference between this shirt and this shirt was that the shirt from 1948 to 1949 had a green collar. This was worn with black shorts, and the socks were mainly green apart from the two thick white hoops, again one around the ankle and the other just below the knee.
And the things he brought will long remain. A phoenix rising, a house of steel, and 60,000 Celtic clean.
So he limped on after the war, 1947, 1948. And in 1948, we had one of our darkest days on the pitch anyway, or we were very close to one of our darkest days on the pitch.
That's right. I mean, for people who don't know, Celtic were almost relegated. Now, I suppose to put it in the context, in 1948 it was mathematically possible on the last day of the season that Celtic could be relegated, so it wasn't as straightforward as, if they had lost, they would have went down. But it was possible, and the fact that a Celtic team was involved in a relegation battle is a disgrace. There's no denying it. It's disgraceful that a club at Celtic size in a country like Scotland was involved in a relegation battle. Again, this was the hangover from the war years, where things weren't done right, and the sort of I suppose we need to go back a couple of years really and look at how this emerged. And again we go back to Jimmy McStay. You said earlier on about Jimmy McStay, resigning, but Jimmy McStay, it was sort of he was made an offer he couldn't refuse. He was asked to leave, he was asked to resign, and he knew that the board were already about to put their successor in, who was Jimmy McGrory. And Jimmy McGrory at that time was an absolute idol to the Celtic fans. The most successful striker in British football history. He had done fairly well at Kilmarnock as a manager as well at that time, often finishing above Celtic in the league. So, it was like a homecoming for McGrory, and those fans groups that had been set up in protest or to watch what was going on at the club, they were delighted, absolutely delighted. And then within a year you had these protests outside Celtic Park, and again the complaint was that Jimmy McGrory wasn't being allowed to do his job. They felt that the meddling that had went on with Jimmy McStay between him and the board would be put aside. McGrory was coming in, McGrory was going to be the man, only to find out that the same damn problems were manifesting themselves again. Mm-hmm. So you're in this situation as well where Celtic are floundering, really, really floundering, and only for Jock Weir, who was brought in from Blackburn Rovers, I think it was, for £7,000, which was no mean fee in those days. Actually, that was a substantial fee. Jock Weir got 3 goals. He'd been there sort of 6 months, and he got 3 goals at the end on the last day to make sure that it was mathematically impossible for Celtic to be relegated. But this was a complete hangover from the lethargy of the early 40s. It was no mistake that these damn things were happening, and for Celtic to be involved at that time, and Jimmy McGrory on the day going to Dens Park, Jimmy McGrory had written his resignation letter and was prepared to hand it in at the end of the match, and that would have been a real indicator to Celtic fans. I'm not sure what would have happened after that. I'm pretty sure that the Celtic fans would have been highly militant if that had have happened. You know, they loved McGrory and they loved their club. There was 31,000 people in Dens Park that day. Dens Park wasn't that big, you know, and the Celtic support still turned out in their numbers to support the team and roll the team on, even though they were facing the prospect of the drop. You know, so it's tough times, really tough times, but it's a marker really of, I suppose, how they just took that support for granted. You know, they didn't really care about the support. And it's so frustrating looking back on it that could have been a time where you are coming out of war where things are pretty, you know, equalised, and you have clubs like Hibs and Morton and Motherwell who are, you know, pumping, you know, who are coming out away from Rangers, you know, but who are coming out of the war in pretty good shape. You know, and Hearts went on under Tommy Walker then in the 50s to have their best period in their career, in their history, you know, in the early 50s. So all things being equal, Celtic were in a far better position, or at least should have been in a far better position to really dominate in that era. And it was such a lost time. It was such a lost time.
We seek him here, we seek him there, never to find is very rare. You can go to any single country in the world and you'll find dedicated.
We're here today at the Celtic Green Brigade Anti-Discrimination Football Tournament. Got a few unsavoury characters here focusing a bit. Tell me your favourite Celtic player.
It's got to be the king in it.
Reggie Blinker. Oh yeah, imposter.
It's got to be Stephen Mahy. Cult favourite for the Celtic.
The French fancy himself.
Definitely.
Evander Snow.
Oh yes he is. Oh yes he is. Oh yes he is. Oh yes he is.
Alright, favourite away game?
Seville.
So we say Dundee there?
No. That's what I was contemplating, the Dundee riots, but
survive, that was a weird thing.
Probably when we beat them 2-0 at the Zoo. Samurai scored 2.
Rennes away.
Cause he's a dedicated follower of Celtic. Oh yes he is.
Favourite other Celtic memory or first game? What's you think of Celtic, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Don't say pyrotechnics, we'll get shut down.
When I think about Celtic, I think Section 111, the most vocal area at Celtic.
Aye, heart and soul of the club.
Town is where he's bound to watch the famous hoops, cause he's a dedicated follower of Celtic.
But I always remember getting stuck down at the old floodlights in the Celtic end. My old man took me, and he used to take me, and I'd be stuck outside the old House pub in Brigton.
Oh yeah, aye.
And my old uncle used to do the Green Citizen, the old paper. He used to do that, so I'd be stuck outside with him, and my old man would be in having a few jars,
few refreshments
after every game. You know, but that was always it. I get stuck at the floodlight, even away, done his thing, and then come back and go at the end of the game. I'll tell you another thing. The second ever Celtic boy in the old Celtic View. The first one was for Castlemilk, the second one was for Castlemilk, and the second one was my brother.
Wow, and what was his first name?
Charlie Kerr.
Charlie Kerr.
County Clare to Singapore of China.
First ever Celtic game was v Dunfermline, and we get beat 2-1. But obviously very special day. I remember actually my first sort of memory of Celtic Park, it's still when people speak about Celtic Park, is driving down London Road and seeing the old floodlights. That's something I've always stick with. It's funny, I don't actually picture inside the stadium. It's when I say Celtic Park, I still picture the big, huge floodlights. And that's sort of my first memory, kind of the biggest memory I have. With my wee pal Michael and his mother Tricia. Just a brilliant experience. Even when we get beat 2-1, it just felt as if that's who you wanted to beat. I read on the very front of Old Celtic end, and it was absolutely brilliant. Just never forget it. Even when we get beat, it was still magical.
Yeah, you'll find dedicated followers of Celtic.
"1941 could prove to be a turning point in the war. Whilst Hitler's Nazi war machine ventures out onto the Frisian Eastern Front to combat Stalin's Red Army, the US joined the war effort, spurred into action by the cowardly attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese Empire."
And Robert Kelly and Jimmy McGrory actually had very similar personalities too. They were very mild-mannered, of Irish descent, Catholic, and I think that was one of the things that probably kept Jimmy McGrory his job for as long as he kept it.
Well, you know,
him and Kelly were quite close, like.
They were close, but I think McGrory made Kelly fireproof. And the Celtic fans loved McGrory, so they were never going to attack him. So Kelly could step back and go, but I've given you the man you wanted in the job. You know, he could stand back and say, you want McGrory, I give you him. In the meantime, behind in the background, he's making Jimmy McGrory's job damn impossible. Yeah. And all the reproach you'll ever get of Jimmy McGrory was how gentlemanly he was. And by gentlemanly, that's what I mean. He was very gentle. You know, he wasn't tough, he wasn't assertive, and Jimmy McStay would have been guilty of probably of the same thing.
Which wasn't the type of player you imagined Jimmy McGrory as being.
No,
but
definitely
as a
not.
manager, he was completely different.
Absolutely, but you have to remember about the origin of the Kelly family. You know, Robert Kelly was a stockbroker. How many stockbrokers do you know nowadays? You know, he was totally divorced from the people who supported the club, and he was totally divorced from the players. He received a private education in one of the big Catholic schools in Scotland. He didn't live in Garngad. You know, he didn't come from the Carlton where McGrory emerged from. You know, so they would have deferred in those old times. They would have deferred to Kelly. You know, he would have been a social better. You know, and that's what makes it so frustrating, because, you know, McGrory may well have known football, but he was never given a chance to actually do that. You know, Robert Kelly picked the team and would do so until Steen arrived. You know, and that's why I keep harking back and saying that our problems and difficulties that we face, you can see them being born. They're given succour in this period. You know, and it took years and years and years to resolve them. And you know, Robert Kelly would have been the type of man as well. I've seen newspaper clippings from Robert Kelly in the late 60s where he's taken all the credit for what Steen did. You know, and I can show you them. You know, he's saying, the decisions we've taken of, you know, bringing in Mr. Steen, doing this and that, you know, and making it as if he's the man, you know, this football guru. But we know different. We know Steen had to fight him, you know, and say to him, look, I'm not coming unless you stand away and stay out of my road. You know, and he would have said one thing to Kelly and done another thing, and only for great results. You know, it saves Steen's bacon. You know, but McGrory wasn't like Steen at all. You know, and you'll never hear an old Celtic player say anything bad about Jim McGrory. They absolutely loved him, they adored him. You know, because they knew he wasn't a hands-on manager, and you know, sometimes they didn't train like they should have, and you know, there was this absolute lethargy at the club, and it came from the top. You know, it came from the decision makers who were in charge at the time, and that was Robert Kelly.
And then in 1948 as well, things started to change again. And I don't know how many times I've said that covering the last 50 odd years of history, but it did change again, and Celtic hired the likes of Jimmy Hogan to come in as coach, and his ethos and the reason why Celtic hired him was to change that attitude of the players. And here was a guy that had been successful all over Europe, and he came in and actually wanted the guys to play football on the pitch.
Exactly, and the whole Hogan period is looked back on as, you know, right man, wrong time. You know, Jimmy Hogan really should have been brought in the 30s, and he would have seen the club through the 40s.
Because he was, you know, late 60s or maybe even 70 before he arrived at Celtic, right?
He was 70 years of age, and you know, the whole ethos of I mean, this is what I said earlier on about Celtic bringing Alec Dowdles. It was so damn schizophrenic. You know, there was so many positive things outweighed completely by those negative things. And again, in the wake of this relegation battle, it frightened Robert Kelly. You know, he knew he was in trouble. He knew that the Celtic fans were out to get him, and he took a course of action that, you know, he was going to try and seriously change things. Bringing in Hogan was one of them. You know, and this guy was a football guru and remains one of the greatest figures in football history, without a shadow of a doubt. I was listening to the World Football phone-in last year on the BBC, and Tim Vickery, who's a fantastic football pundit, was waxing on about Jimmy Hogan, and the first thing he called him Jimmy Hogan of Celtic.
Oh, really?
You know, yeah. So Hogan's still associated with our club among football circles. It's mental. You know, it's crazy. But again, a lot of the things were you know, people would have always said, you know, some of the players, you know, took the piss out of Hogan because he was old. Some players did, but other players didn't. The football players in the team didn't. And when Steen came in the early 1950s, the ghost of Hogan and Hogan's approach was still lingering about. And Steen learned a lot from it, reintroducing the ball, training and all that sort of stuff. That was Hogan, and Hogan was involved in that sort of Central European football boom, of the late 30s, 40s and 50s. And when England were beaten 8-3 in Wembley in sort of 1953, 1954, around about that time, Hungary, the Magyars invited Hogan as their guest, and they said, "But we play Hogan's football." That was their phrase. Jimmy Hogan taught us how to play. And after that scalping, Billy Wright, the England captain, said, people regard Jimmy Hogan as a traitor. The English now regard him, and he said that it's quoted. He says there's people around here that believe he's a traitor. So this guy was an absolute genius, and it was an inspired decision by Kelly, but it was too late. Hogan was too old, and I know players like Charlie Tully absolutely loved him. Charlie has a reputation of someone who hated training and all that. Nothing could be further from the truth. Charlie Tully absolutely loved training. He just loved a certain type of training. He liked playing with a football. He liked working on skills. Scoring from corners doesn't happen by accident. And those tricks and things that he works on doesn't happen by accident. I had this argument with his son, and me and Charlie had a row one day, and Charlie says, "Oh no, my dad with his God-given talent." And I went, "Your dad didn't have God-given talent. You're giving too much credit to God." I says, your dad went round Belfast as a child, hoking out football matches and practicing and playing, and he would have played 3 and 4 matches a day. What's that got to do with God? He was practicing his skills, and Tully loved Jimmy Hogan. Loved him, and he said in his own memoir, he says that Jimmy Hogan at that time was actually in digs with him, and they used to go to the pictures together, because he felt sorry for him. He was an old man in his 70s, and he says that all he ever wanted to talk about was football. They probably wanted to talk about movie stars and girls or whatever, but it was just football. And his whole life revolves around football. He's a wonderful figure. It's such a Hogan that it's such a shame that he wasn't more involved in the club. But there, even 3 or 4 years later, he's still being feted in the highest football tables. As a genius.
What's it like now, Derek, whenever, you think you've been collecting all these things for many, many years, and how difficult it was at times to get your hands on Celtic memorabilia, and then you go into this wonderful superstore that we have today, and it's coming down with all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
Anything you can imagine you can put a Celtic crest on is in the superstore.
Correct. That's the Celtic. The Celtic support's a massive support, so they have a wide range of just anything, and they'll get the Celtic crest on it, and there might be a customer for it. So it's a market Celtic have got to go down. It's a good idea, and they've got to be added.
It's a Celtic toaster I want. Let's make no bones about it. I'm after the Celtic toaster that puts a Celtic crest on the bits of bread. I think that's brilliant. Anybody that hasn't got a Celtic toaster can't even call themselves a Celtic supporter. In my opinion. You got a Celtic toaster, Derek?
I'll remember that when you get married.
So, what about when it comes to the likes of books and things like that? Are you a big collector of Celtic books? Because again, when you go into a bookstore, you go into a superstore, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books. Is that something that you've built up over the years too?
Well, actually, I did have a complete collection of Celtic books, and I've changed it because room-wise, when I moved home once, I decided I had to get rid of certain books because it take up quite a bit. I decided to get rid of most of my books. But the ones that I collect now is, because I like autographs, is books that are fully signed, So if I get a night, like most of the Lisbon Lions who have done a book, lucky enough I've managed to get them all fully signed. I've also got the original Willie Maley book, which, has got the dust jacket on it, which has got a nice Celtic crest, but it's also signed by the first team and the second team of that period, 1938, and also by the manager, Willie McStay. Yeah, so that, books, that's what I like, signed ones now, maybe Jenky's with, his autograph on it and so on. That's my theme on the books.
So I have to ask you one question before we finish up, Derek.
Certainly.
What's missing from your collection? What's the one thing? What's the pot of gold or the holy grail for every Celtic collector?
Oh, I don't know. A 2014 European Champions League medal.
I'll buy that. Brilliant answer. Very good. So, Derek, if anybody wants to see your stuff or follow your stuff, is there any way they can do it?
I'm on Twitter at Collect Celtic FC. Collectibles, I've done it TI. I'm also on Facebook, Celtic Collectibles again.
Fantastic.
And they can follow and add me there if they wanted.
Derek, brilliant to talk to you today. It's great to have someone who is collecting Celtic history as part of the Celtic History podcasts.
Glad to help. Glad to help.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Derek.
Thank you.
So you've humoured me now over the last 8 years, and we only have touched on Charles Patrick Tully and Bertie Peacock and all that there kind of stuff. Go on, off you go. Enjoy yourself for the last 2 years of the decade, Marty.
Well, again, I mean, this has to be wheeled into the relegation battle. None of this sits on its own. And as I say, Robert Kelly was frightened. He was. I think he was genuinely scared of. He knew he was in trouble, and so he went to Belfast Celtic at last. And not only did he take Charlie Tully, but he also went for Jimmy Jones. Some of the historians have said that he was after 3 players who were Tully, Charlie Curry, and Jackie Vernon. It's not true about Vernon. He tried to get Vernon before. Vernon had already left the club by that stage, but they had came over sort of a couple of years before and saw Jackie Vernon play and went, wow, what's he worth? To which Belfast Celtic said he's worth 10 grand, and Celtic panicked. Kelly says I could never spend £10,000 on a defender. The Celtic fans wouldn't allow it. They wouldn't allow it. So he came back in 48. By that stage, Vernon had left and went to West Brom, and he had been looking for Charlie Curry, Jimmy Jones and Tully, and he only managed to land Tully. And the big what if in Celtic's history, as far as I'm concerned, was around Vernon and Curry. When the older Belfast Celtic fans will tell you that when Jackie Vernon left, Jackie Vernon was an incredible centre half, unbelievable. Ireland captain, played in the victory, the internationals for Great Britain at the end of the Second World War. And the great what if is if Celtic had signed Jackie Vernon, it's really unlikely they would ever have signed Jock. And Charlie Curry, who Robert Kelly came to buy in 48, when the older Belfast Celtic fans will tell you when Vernon left Celtic didn't miss him. When Vernon left Belfast Celtic, they didn't miss Jackie Vernon because Charlie Curry was already there and stepped into his shoes. When Charlie Curry had been there for 5 or 6 years. So at least, you've got to give Robert Kelly a bit of credit for at least trying. He was over here rooting out players that would do the job, and well, he got it in Tully. He got it in Tully. He got a player who the Tom Campbell book on Tully's life. One of the most interesting aspects of it for me was that he broke down the attendances. He matched the attendances to the previous year. So he gave you the sort of the 6-month attendances for late 48 and matched them against late 47. And Tully was in the team by 48, and there was genuinely tens of thousands of extra fans. 30, 40, 50 thousand extra fans coming to watch Celtic play with Tully. So Billy McNeil at Charlie Tully's graveside in 1971 pulled Charlie Jr. aside and spoke to him and said, basically, your dad saved this club. We were in such a bad way. Billy McNeil then was coming through as a youth player or was about to join, and he said, listen, let nobody tell you any different. He was coming through in the 50s, so he would have been around that atmosphere of what had gone on, in the late 40s, and that would have been still damn fresh in people's minds, And I'm lucky for Paul Brennan. He's going to be looking next week in the next insertion at the 50s, and compared to the 40s, it was manna. You had league wins and cup wins and all these individual little cups like the Simungo Cup and the Coronation Cup to talk about, and the seeds of that were done, I suppose, in the wake of this relegation battle where they were frightened. And unfortunately, some of the lessons weren't learned. Kelly still interfered with the teams right up until Steen came, and it's mental. But Tully, I suppose it's very hard for us to imagine now, sitting here, you're sitting in your team. I suppose it is comparable to the 90s, where your team hadn't won the league in 10 years. That happened. Celtic hadn't won the league since the late 30s. Now you're sitting at 48, 47, 48 going, Jesus Christ, it's been a decade from we've even getting anywhere near the league. So I suppose that would be comparable. And then having just this one guy come in and lighten the whole place up. The writers, the historians that reading through the stuff have blamed the other players in the team for this, and for Celtic not making more of what they had, because Tully was intelligent and he was still young. He was getting into great positions and he was giving the ball, but the other players were maybe too slow or hadn't the wit to see what he was doing. And then Tully became frustrated because he became bored. He was one of those players, he was one of those players that would drift out of the game then. And we know, like looking back at Aidan McGeady's career, for example, and, you really have to have that sort of string pull. People need to be on the same wavelength for it to work, or it doesn't work. People then get written off as sand dancers or and that sort of thing, but it's all about getting the right players at the right time. So for example, if they had landed Jimmy Jones from Belfast Celtic, the great striker, the record, the Jimmy McGrory of the Irish League, his goal scoring record in the Irish League will never be matched in the same way that McGrory's won't. If they had maybe got Jones at that time as well. And we all know what happened to Jones. Jimmy at the riot in 1948, where his leg was broken, that precipitated. Within a year of Charlie Tully leaving, Belfast Celtic was gone. Yeah. It's incredible to think that you had all this talent was just in this club that was a sister club or a brother club to the Glasgow Celtic. Then was gone.
What's really interesting, Marty, is when you look at the last trophy that they win in the 40s. When you look at the Charity Cup final on 6th of May 1949, here's the team, and this is why I'm going to read this out. This is where you start to see Celtic move into a different phase of becoming the machine that they became throughout the 50s, the 60s and the 70s. So here's the team, right? Bonner, Hoffney, Milne, Evans, McGrory, Bailey, Collins, Furdy, McPhail, Peacock and Tully. At last there was a team that promised an awful lot.
Yeah, you had the talent there. That's the problem. And that problem is reflected in the fact that all the bloody Lisbon Lions were there before Lisbon.
Yeah.
They only brought in, was it Willie Wallace brought in from Hearts? They were all there. That problem persisted. There was absolutely no problem bringing through talent. It was making that talent work when it got there. And that's where the fall down was with Charlie Tully. They should have been building their team around Tully and bringing in everybody to work with him. He had put tens of thousands on the gate. So the money should have been rolling in. And they should have been making real strategic decisions to say, right, here, this is where we need to strengthen. And Willie Maley was a great advocate of, your goalkeeper, your centre half and your striker, and that's all you need. And that Spain never, wasn't really there. After Willie Miller left, for example, as the keeper, you had Johnny Bonner, you had a couple of different keepers, coming and going over that 10-year period. So nobody was really settled, and you had people like Bertie Peacock being played out of position, and even this is what I'm saying about it being so schizophrenic. Bringing in Bobby Collins was massive. Yep. It was absolutely massive and a brilliant decision. And Bobby Collins turning around to Everton and saying, "I'm not going. I'm not going. I'm staying with Celtic." There was a whole wrangle over his contract, and he had signed and he didn't sign and all that stuff. And the player put his foot down and said, "I'm not going. I'm signing for Celtic." So you had real commitment there. You had players who wanted to be there. And again, they were being totally hamstrung by this crazy directorship and management structure that destroyed what it created. And it's such a shame.
A fantastic way to end this chapter, talking about what's going to happen next.
Well, exactly, and you had those, as you pointed out, you really did have a nucleus of players there, and over the next couple of years, things did brighten up and things did look up. And again, the things like, I suppose these are silly things, but it says a lot about the schizophrenic nature. They treated their players like crap. They wouldn't play them properly, but yet they took them to Rome. Because Robert Kelly was a Catholic, and so was Jimmy McGrory. I will take the lads to Rome. We'll play Lazio and we'll see the Pope. And it was a wonderful thing to do for their players. Some of those guys, as we know, would have been miners. Would have been down mines, but here they were being taken to Rome. And being allowed to see a different way of life in a different world. And in 1951 they took them to America, and let them see America again. They hadn't been there in 20 years. So it's so schizophrenic. In some ways it was awful, and in some ways it was brilliant. It's mental. And people look back in the 40s and write it off.
It was never dull, that's for sure.
It certainly wasn't. It can't be for a time when nothing happened. It really can't be accused of being dull at all. It can't.
When I look at all the decades that we're going to be covering here, and when I started off with this little project, I thought, oh my God, it's going to be so tough doing all these early decades, because I'll fly through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s and 80s right up to modern day. And only when you look back at again, periods like the 40s, you realise I can talk about modern stuff, but everybody knows the modern stuff. Mm-hmm. But when you go back and you read about the dead decade that was the 40s, it was far from dead.
And this is the point I made about Tom Colgan. There's still work to do, you know, and a lot of it has been, for obvious reasons, hasn't been dwelt on, I suppose. You know, people want to get into the 50s and want to get into the Steine era, and that's brilliant, you know, that's absolutely fine by me. You know, I'll be listening to all these podcasts in the same vein. You know, and the ones that have gone before this one have been outstanding, really outstanding. But you can't ignore this stuff. All this stuff happened. And this is your Fergus McCann takeover. This is your Lisbon. This is your Coronation Cup. This is your League Cup win in 1967. This is your bloody drought. This is your drought between the League Cup final of 1957 and your Scottish Cup win of 1965 under Stein. This is this is where this is coming from. You know, so to brush it off and ignore it, I think, is a real travesty. And you know, the Belfast Celtic, I'm involved in the Belfast Celtic Society, as you know, and the story of Belfast Celtic weaves into this, you know, as well, which is a nice link. You know, because in the 50s, then you have Glasgow Celtic coming back and playing friendlies against Belfast Celtic when they don't even exist. Mm-hmm. You know, the club's gone, the football team is gone. You know, so it's a stunning period of history, and the flag protest as well in 53. You know, for Paul Brown to get his teeth into that, I think is a cracker. You know, I think it's brilliant. I can't wait to hear it.
Great stuff. Marty Flynn, this has been an absolute pleasure as usual.
Just before I sign off, can I say one thing?
Yes.
I heard Tom Minogue last week, and he wanted to donate his money to Belfast Celtic. So I just want to thank him. I think for someone to be thinking of our society, keeping the memory of our old club alive here in Belfast, I think is absolutely wonderful and very, very touching. So I just want to pass on my thanks to Tom for such a generous thought.
And on that vein, I need you to select a charity that will benefit from the donations that are being made to the Celtic History podcast, Marty.
My nominated charity will be the Celtic Grave Society, and I know that the Celtic Grave Society will probably tell you that they don't have any money needs and that they want them to go to different charities who really do. But I know some of the stuff that the Graves lads are involved in, and they do need the money, and I would really implore anybody listening to this podcast to give them a hand, to go and join the society or make a donation, because they have stuff coming up that's going to be stunning, and I mean stunning. And if you care about the history of this club, you better support the Celtic Graves. That's as far as I'm concerned, and I wish them well. We've been very lucky in the last week that we've had the lads over here for a celebration of Mickey Hummel and his life, and of Belfast Celtic in general, and they I suppose the whole thing around the 125th anniversary, I think the Celtic Graves event at St Mary's Church in November was the highlight as far as I'm concerned. I don't care what else was done. For me, that was so touching and so brilliantly done. These guys are in the business.
Also inspired us to beat Barcelona.
There you go.
Thank you, Marty. It's been absolutely brilliant fun, and we'll see where it goes.
We will indeed. Hail, hail.
Cheers, Marty. So there is our folks, that's the end of chapter 5. Absolutely enjoyed that. Good to catch up with my old pal Marty Flynn from the Belfast Celtic Society and from the Huddle Board, of course. So thank yous this week, of course, to the Human Torpedo, Chris from the Paradise Report, Pat from Half the World Away podcast, Stuart from the CelticShirt.co.uk, Derek Taylor from the Celtic Collectibles. That was a cracking wee interview as well. Super stuff. Kelly from Stonehouse, The Wakes, Charlie and the Boys Nelson for the music. Also to Terry Dick, Glenn Daly's son, who told the stories about all the songs and stuff at the beginning. Thanks to the Parrot for doing all the interviews at the Green Brigade Day Out. And most importantly, everybody for downloading it and for donating. The donations are coming along lovely. Getting close to our target, but still a way to go. And remember, if you go into heelheelmedia.com, you can find the Celtic History podcasts. Click on the link and it will bring you to the donate page, where you can pay through PayPal or any major credit card and give us 50p, £1, £5, £10, some people said it's £20, and every single penny counts, and all the money raised by the podcast will go straight to charity, of course. So do it right if you haven't done it already, and send us a few quid for charity. Remember, we were going to originally charge everybody for each of these podcasts, and it would have cost you probably about a tenner to listen to all 10 episodes. So rather than iTunes taking a chunk out of that, it'll all go to the charity selected by our guests. So, talking of guests, next week, Paul Brennan from the Celtic Quick News will cover 1950 and 1960. The Coronation Cup and Hampden in the sun. How fantastic is that going to be? A wee shout out as well to everybody that's been promoting the podcast, either on Twitter or on Facebook or on the multitude of Celtic message boards that have had a thread on there. And the comments that I've read on most of them have been absolutely brilliant and really makes it worthwhile. A lot of people put a lot of work into this. And, you know, when you look at doing 10, 11 podcasts in this series, the amount of clips that we have to get in to get the show together. And we're now up to 2 hours for this one. And I can see that being the case for the remaining ones too. So as a wee reward for everybody that's been involved in it, come on, give us a few quid if you haven't done so already. We'd love to go to the charities at the end of all this and give them something that might make a difference. So just before I go, Chapter 5 is dedicated to the memory of Pat McTaggart from the Houston Emerald CSC. And I've known Pat for many, many years, and a nicer guy you couldn't have met. And sadly, Pat passed away this week. And Pat's a bit of my Celtic history as well. So this goes out to you, Pat. Heal, heal.
It was Saturday, 12th of November 1988. Celtic were playing Rangers that day. In the morning, I was playing football in my primary school for Drummy Thistle. So we finished the game. Don't know who we were playing, don't know what the score was. Finished the game and I came out of the changing rooms and I was walking through the school, going home. And my brother was walking through the school coming to meet me. My brother ran our supporters bus at the time in Drumchapel, and just at that he threw my scarf at me. I always remember my scarf. It was the white scarf with the green and yellow kind of hoops on it, with the 2 green hoops and a yellow hoop in the middle. He threw my scarf at me and he says, "Right, wee man, we're going to the game, you're going to the game." Oh, I was delighted, I was absolutely made up. The previous Celtic Rangers game, they had done us 5-1 at Ibrox, but obviously at that age I wasn't concerned about that. We were going to Celtic Park to beat Rangers, and that was all there was about it. So we went to the game and we ended up in the Celtic end that day. I don't know why we ended up in the Celtic end, because we normally stood in the jungle. But I always remember we were in the Celtic end at exit 5. I was sitting on the barrier at exit 5, and the biggest memory of that game, is everybody will remember, is Terry Butcher's flying header. Oh gee man, right in the top corner, absolute belter, and the whole place just went up. "Nice one, Terry, nice one, son. Nice one, Terry, let's have another one." So we beat them 3-1 that day. Billy Stark and Mark McGee scored the other goals. Mark Walters scored a penalty for the Huns up at the Rangers end. But oh, what a day. The 11th of November 1988, a day that I'll never forget.
One of my favourite memories as a Celtic supporter is the 1988 Cup final, where McAvenny scored his 2 goals and put us into the history books. It was an interesting day because as much as we thought that Celtic were probably going to win, you know, there's always that expectation. And then after Kevin Gallagher scored, then again there was the worry that, is this going to happen today? Well, it did, and McAvenny scored the 2 goals, and we won the cup. But my favourite part of that day is that after winning the cup, me and my dad walked back down to the Gorbals, where we met my nana and my auntie. And they surprised me with 2 tickets, for the Celtic show at the Pavilion. So as you could imagine, the Pavilion was jumping. The roof was open in the Pavilion because it was so hot. and it was a fantastic show. The actors had to stop the show now and again because the fans were just singing and singing and singing. And then to end the night, the team, I think it was some of the players, jumped at the big cake that came on the stage with the League Championship and the Scottish Cup. Well, you can imagine what happened to the pavilion. I'm amazed to this day it's still standing. It was a great night, a great day and a great season.